I actually spent a lot of time here at MIT when I was studying at Wellesley, because if you're going to get a computer science degree and you have access to MIT, of course you should. So it's always fun to come back. I'm, as Sandy said, currently doing public policy at Mozilla that has a broad range of issues, one of which is data and transparency. As Sandy mentioned, Mozilla is best known as the maker of Firefox. All right. All right, I'm using paper notes then. We like to think of ourselves as a little bit of a unique company. We're partially a company, we're partially an advocate, and we don't play the typical role for either. We are bound by cause and community, and that community and the principles of that community drives us. We want to create public policy around issues like this that helps us and everyone else build the web that we want. We like to think of ourselves as a global movement. We have users everywhere. We have a huge presence and are working on how to create inclusion globally. And as I said, build the web we want. We liked pragmatic, user-oriented solutions. I think that will be in line with what all of you are working on, and I'm excited to hear about it. And we like to engage on these things very thoughtfully. We joined DTL because the mission really resonated with us. If you look at how I've characterized DTL here, data-driven investigators and stakeholders working together to create data transparency and positive data policy across hard problems, you'll notice that I use the word data a lot. We like data. Data is fantastic. We want to collect the right data to understand what's going on, and we want to make sure that people are using data in responsible ways. We joined because we like this data. We want to create ways to find that data and use that data and analyze that data to help us understand what's going on the web, how our users are thinking, what's going on in society. We want to create transparency, and that is going to require data. We want to foster this community to create methodologies and tools that help us understand what is happening to our digital trace. This is also the opportunity to create tools around this data, and so I'm excited to hear how DTL is thinking of evolving and creating these grants, helping people understand what's going on. And in creating this open community, DTL plays a very important role. I'm hoping to stay involved, and maybe we can go back to Barcelona. That would be lovely. I think that the other piece of this that is important is that the Data Transparency Lab involves actual people, implementers, stakeholders across the spectrum, not just folks thinking deep thoughts, which is always good, but people going out and measuring and checking and figuring out which of our assumptions are right and which ones are wrong. There are a lot of angles to transparency and to education, and we have the opportunity, as I said, to create those tools for users and for ourselves to help understand the ecosystem. As you all know, the web started 25 years ago as a very, very user-centric mechanism. It's evolved, and it's evolved into a data-centric internet. That creates friction. Users start to worry. That's a problem. As the great studies earlier showed, people have a lot of concerns. People don't know what to do. I think that we have the chance to help with that. I think the transparency is really the catalyst to help fix these problems. The idea that we can, embrace this new information economy without throwing away privacy and transparency and control is an important idea. When I say the new information economy, I mean something particularly specific. The web for very good reason, transacts a lot of data. Some of that is personal data, some of that is not personal data. Some of it is to a website that you're interacting with directly. Some of it is to a third party that you may or may not know is even there. Some of that data sharing is accidental. Some of it's malicious. I think that these are all important categories to think about as we gather data and create transparency. A lot of people are very concerned about all of this data flowing all over the internet. I like to remind folks that data is not inherently harmful. I think that in this room that's particularly salient because one of the things we're doing is collecting a lot of data to understand how data flows. Collecting that user data, personal data, can be very helpful. It can create very compelling products, services, and experiences, but it needs to be done in the right way. There's a huge amount of responsibility involved when you're collecting personal data. One of the biggest problems, I think, in the web today is that the user doesn't necessarily know what's being collected, and it doesn't necessarily know what that value exchange looks like. Many services have done such a good job of creating this black box around the data that they're using and the information they collect that the user doesn't understand. I think that there's, folks have started to realize, hey, if I don't share my location information with my maps, it can't give me the directions that I want. Okay, interesting. And so you see there's a little bit of transparency around that because the product simply stops working. But there are lots of other situations where one website may have lots of third-party integrations that are critical to the website's function, but the user doesn't understand the implications there. So we can create transparency, we can create tools, and we can start to educate users better as we embrace this new information internet economy. If the collection is hidden or if choices are limited, users start to mistrust the entire ecosystem, and that's a huge loss. So the web's been around for around 25 years. It's changed the way that we interact and communicate. I personally, I have my smartphone on me at all times. I was traveling in Europe with bad signal a couple of weeks ago, and it's really striking how dependent I've become on this background flow of data. This is, I think, striking and important. We are so connected. Again, that's why these questions are all so important. When I talk about friction around user data, I'm meaning users mistrusting the ecosystem, people being concerned, the 6 o'clock news, talking about, what if you have cookies, what if you have malware? I think, data privacy and security has become a dinner table topic in a way that is surprising to me, but positive. I think that, 10 years ago, I would have guessed that this was just benign, boring, no one was very interested, but suddenly we have user interest and consumer interest in a way that I hope we can take advantage of. That friction creates, user concerns, and we can address those. Giving users control over their data can be very hard. One of the things I'm hoping comes out of DTL's grants is user control tools. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that Mozilla has developed in response to user concerns and various surveys and just things we think are cool and useful. We need to develop the methodologies to understand what's going on online. We need to figure out where our data is going. We need tools and best practices for using data responsibly. And we need to respect the user, which means protecting their privacy. I think it's important to note that at this point, all businesses are data businesses, all stakeholders in the internet economy, and everyone is going to be impacted if we create an ecosystem of mistrust here. I think we have the opportunity to create that 443 billion from your slides, and I think that there are a number of studies that try to quantify this. I think that it's useful to pull in some of those statistics so that we can think about, what we have to lose and what we have to work for. Another report from McKinsey actually estimated, did a study of about 15 countries and estimated that the internet accounts for about 3.4% of the overall GDP in those countries. That doesn't sound like a big number until you step back and think about it. That's 3.5% of the entire gross domestic product is not small at all. It outpaces agriculture, it outpaces the energy sector, and it's growing very, very quickly. There's a huge uptick. I think we're still, increasing the speed at which the internet economy grows. I think, one of the more interesting pieces of this survey is that they realized that 75% of the economic value created by internet companies doesn't go to something you would traditionally think of as an internet company. It goes to your car company, and it goes to the people who are building, the new apartment building across the way. I think, these traditional industries have benefited from the internet industry pushing forward and creating this ecosystem. So that is where we have to lose. Everything slows down. Creating transparency and control around this data will simply, very, very simply, help the internet economy. Studies repeatedly show people are concerned about the web. They don't know what's going on. They don't know what the data use is. They don't even know what data they need to be worried about. I definitely encourage you all to help create, information about information, data about data. We need to help people understand maybe this piece of data is very sensitive and I need to take very good care of it, but there's this other piece that I'm just not that worried about, and the implications of where you bucket your sensitivities. One thing I wanted to note, and that I think is incredibly striking, is that we're concerned about this, but we're not the only folks. Traditionally, there has been a set of folks who are concerned about privacy, and they'll be in the corner, and they have a lot of very valid concerns. But as I said, this is becoming a dinner table topic. Everyone is noticing, and everyone is noticing that the ecosystem as it sits right now is broken. IAB is one of the advertising trade groups. They put this article out a few weeks ago, and I found it very striking. What you can't actually, well, it actually starts, you can see, we messed up. They are saying we pushed the technology without thinking about the user, and we need to fix it. And they're, proposing a new kinds of ads that, doesn't hit your computer's performance. It's encrypted. It supports the existing opt-outs. And it's just not annoying, which I think is actually a pretty good outline of some of the concerns people have about ads. Of course, they didn't really mention the data part. So it will be interesting to see how they address that, but I thought it was striking that even the advertising trade group, whose job is to go out and promote advertising, and they have a self-regulatory framework as well, is willing to admit that the way that the ecosystem works right now is simply unsustainable. People don't trust it, people don't like it. So this is our problem statement for today, from my perspective. Please feel free to contradict me in your next panels. But the web has become an ecosystem centered around data. We need to bring it back to the user and back to the user-centric web. That is what will increase trust and continue to create value throughout the internet ecosystem. As I said, data is not necessarily the problem. It's incredibly valuable. It creates a huge amount of that value in the internet economy. And the value exchange is sometimes clear, sometimes it's not. User transparency and control is vital, and part of that transparency and control needs to be telling the user why this benefits them. I think that there are some very compelling examples. People love their online services. They want them to work well. So if we are to continue developing products and services, we need data about how users use them, when they break, When they don't, I think I wear my Fitbit all the time because I understand the value proposition. Fitbit collects a lot of data about me for me. They have put forth a pretty good privacy policy that tells me what they do and don't do with their data. Of note, they revised that privacy policy in response to pressure from policymakers and technologists and academics, the people in this room. But because they've done that, I trust the company, I trust what they're doing, I trust that the regulators will keep an eye on what they're doing, and I am able to tell you exactly how many minutes I slept last night, how many steps I took. A lot of very interesting stuff. So at Mozilla, we have learned, we have always held user control and transparency up as principles, but we have learned that they're very important as these keys for trust. And trust is that currency that will create a healthy internet ecosystem. We employ these principles in all of our products. And we're happy that we're not the only ones. I mentioned Fitbit, Intuit, which makes the TurboTax software, and I believe some other accounting software, has done studies and stepped in and said, here's what our users expect us to do with their data. And they actually found that, yes, the users expect them to use their data, not necessarily for just one purpose, but they do expect you to use that data only for their benefit. I think that that's an important distinction. I'd love to hear later other folks that you guys think are doing a great job, because I think that if we hold up the companies that are doing a great job, others can follow. I think that there's a lack of best practices, and we have the opportunity to help companies understand how to do this. We want folks to understand what's going on with their data. We want them to be empowered in their web experience. There's tons of coverage, as I mentioned, on the 6 p.m. news, in the newspaper, online, about all of these problems. So I'm hoping to see a lot about all of the solutions today and in the future. We need to educate and empower our users and help them understand. I wanted to talk about our data principles. It comes out of the Mozilla Manifesto, which is the set of 10 principles that drives Mozilla. Feel free to take a look at the other ones. But the relevant one today is that security and privacy on the internet are fundamental and must not be treated as optional. This drives the tools, this drives the products, and the thinking at Mozilla. When we sat down in 2010 and thought about what that really meant in principles, how should we interpret the manifesto when we're actually building a product? Because while this is fantastic, it doesn't tell you much about how to build a product. The first data privacy principle that we came to was no surprises. And I think that is one of the core elements. It's pretty clear that there are a lot of surprises happening for users right now online. Lots of folks are, I go to Zappos and then shoes follow me around the internet everywhere. And that is surprising to people. I think that there's a lot of examples of this. And again, I hope that the ad industry takes that to heart and starts making a better experience so that everyone wins here. We engineer Firefox in our other products to make sure that everything is clear. We try to do that through notice, layered contextual notice, as well as options and tools. Next, user control. When I'm talking about tools, I'm talking a lot about control. We have some tools that are simply transparency. We have other tools that give the user control over their data as they use the browser and as they surf the internet. A third principle is limited data. We collect what we need, we identify it when we can, and we delete it when we don't need it anymore. I think thinking critically about what data you need and what data you don't is actually a step that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations don't necessarily take. And as we see data breaches, as we see data usages that we find concerning, that should be the first step, stepping back and saying, I need this data. but I don't need it in a week. All right, I'll delete it. I don't need it next year. All right, then I'll delete it. And setting out that life cycle for data. Next is sensible settings. There needs to be a balance of safety and user experience. And that means talking about defaults. That means making settings available. It means making them effective. And it means educating the user about what a setting does and doesn't do. Last but not least, defense in depth. We need multi-layered controls. We need to encourage security to be built in. And we need practices that can be publicly verified by folks like you in this community. I think that that is a very useful service to provide. And of course, you're not always going to be able to get at all of the security controls, and things like policy controls on data usage are harder to audit, but it's worth looking at and worth thinking about. The two most important principles are going to be trust, or control and transparency, and those will build user trust. That will empower users. I want to talk a little bit about how these principles inform the technology that we make. Firefox itself is a browser. There are plenty of browsers out there. We try to make it as privacy and security protective as possible. And then we build some tools that are just kind of interesting. This is a Firefox plugin called Lightbeam. It checks all of the websites that you surf to on the web, and it says, all right, so who are the third parties here? And then it starts connecting them and saying, who are the third parties that you see across multiple sites? This is actually 10 sites that I visited. There's a bunch of different settings, and I'll show you a couple of screenshots. And you can see a huge number of third parties and then 10 first parties. You can see I checked the news, I went to Facebook, I used Google, Politico, WeWork. I can actually identify most of those. And then a bunch of triangular third parties, and I don't really know any of them. There's Pinterest, I see Flickr, but not a ton of identifiable logos. This is what it looks like over a week. Lots more sites. You can see Mozilla in there, BuzzFeed. I will admit, a terrible, terrible social media person. I click on all the clickbait. Washington Post. And so there's about, I believe, 265 third parties across these domains. That in and of itself, that number doesn't mean a lot. I don't know whether that's because, those 265 folks are because there was a YouTube embed and I watched it and it was interesting. I don't know if that's a tracking pixel that's trying to identify me with a super cookie. There's a lot of options. There's a broad spectrum of practices across those third parties. We built this purely as an educational tool. It's useful, it's interesting. I can't really figure out exactly what I want to do with that data, but it makes me think about what I'm doing online. It makes me think about my privacy settings. It makes me identify maybe there are specific times I don't want a site to show up here. Then I can use private browsing mode. If you click on the information icon, it gives you some more context, and I think users enjoy that. There are studies out there that show that users actually engage with this kind of thing, and that causes them to engage with their settings. One of those settings is actually the Firefox Forget button. That will wipe out browsing history and cookies from a selected time frame without impacting the rest of your information. Maybe, I think, maybe you're buying Christmas gifts and don't want them in your browser history, or many, many other use cases. Or maybe, you're just not comfortable with that website you just saw and you want to wipe out the state management technologies, that kind of thing. We're really interested to see how this gets used. As you can see, you can choose 5 minutes, 2 hours, 24 hours, and then of course all of the traditional browser history clearing is available in the settings as well. But this puts it front and center, right, ready to use. One tool that we just launched is tracking protection in private browsing mode. So private browsing mode, like incognito mode and other private modes in browsers, has always dumped the state management, the browser history, the cookies after a session is closed. However, we talked to users, and they understood that private browsing to be protecting them from the third-party site, from the server, so not on the local machine, but instead they assumed that that Google didn't see them when they served ads, that Facebook didn't see them when they saw a like button. And while we don't have necessarily statistically rigorous data around this, it was a theme that came up as we talked to our users over and over again. And so we created tracking protection. If you take a look at this is private browsing mode, which now when you activate private browsing mode, which is, as we understand it, a signal that a user does not want to be tracked, we actually don't load third-party elements of the page. That means that the server never hears from you. There is no record. It just never gets sent. It's experimental. We launched it last week or the week before in Firefox 42. And we want to see how it works. We want to see what parts of it work, what parts of it don't. Because the reality is, if you don't, as I mentioned, there are so many integrations on the web now that blocking third-party loads often breaks things. And so we're trying to see what that breaks, how to improve it. We're working with a partner, Disconnect. We use their list, which actually identifies a few of those third-party options that are integral to pages functioning. So I believe YouTube embeds is one of them because people think of them as part of the page and they interact with them as opposed to purely a tracking beacon, et cetera. So you should play around with it, see what you think, see what could be improved. So we're also thinking about how we can approach other hard problems. When we sit down and we think about it, applying these principles becomes, part of the process. One thing we are thinking about right now is something we're calling content blocking, also known as ad blocking. We published a blog post not too, maybe a month ago, talking about ad blocking. It's becoming increasingly common to use an ad blocker. At the end of the day, we don't know why people are using ad blockers. There are plenty of people who maybe are doing it for privacy concerns. Maybe they're doing it because they've noticed their web browser got really slow with all of these third-party calls. Perhaps they, simply don't like the annoying shoes following them around the internet. We don't really understand why people are using those ad blockers, but they are. We outlined 3 principles that we think are important for these tools, and we are hoping that we can help the community find better information about why users are using these. These principles, one is content neutrality, which is why we're calling it a content blocker and not an ad blocker. Ads themselves are not the problem necessarily. Certainly for some users, they may simply not like ads. But for other users, it's performance or annoyance. Or maybe they're on a data-capped plan and they just don't want to load anything they don't have to on their cell phone. We want these tools to have transparency and openness. That means I know what's getting blocked and I know why, and I know what the process is to come to that conclusion, and potentially what the process is to change that conclusion. And we believe that these tools should be open and maintain a level playing field as opposed to advantaging anyone in particular. I think a lot of folks don't think about all of those reasons for using content blocking. I recently started using AdBlock. Why? It's not for privacy reasons. I have my settings set in such a way that I'm fairly comfortable with the privacy implications of my web browsing. But a news site that I use pretty routinely auto-plays video about 15 seconds after you load the tab. And I can't figure out how to stop it. And so I installed AdBlock. AdBlock stops it, but it's actually doing a whole lot more than I needed it to do. So one of the things that we are hoping comes out of these discussions is a little bit more nuanced understanding of why users make particular choices. So really, Why are we here? Because we want to do something. What can we do? As an industry, we need to keep the user at the center of the product vision. And as a community, we need to encourage industry to do that. It's the only way to create that trust that I've been talking about, encourage that internet ecosystem, and make sure folks keep enjoying, using, benefiting from the internet. The best way to understand that will be data-driven, and that is the data that you are all creating, finding, collecting, analyzing, and telling us all about. One of the other things that we can do is talk about what the best practices look like. I think that there are plenty of companies, industries, individuals who are making really cool things, but not necessarily asking all of the right questions to create the right tools and conclusions in their products. Internal processes will help them, and we can help them understand how to create those processes. I always pick on Angry Birds, which is not necessarily fair. But if I am the developer of the next Angry Birds, and it's me and my friend in a garage, the very stereotypical Silicon Valley startup, I'm not necessarily going to be thinking about the privacy choices, the security choices I need to be making for my users, the tools, the defaults. I think we can help those companies do that in a lightweight way, and one that they have the ability to do even before they're big. And these questions come straight out of the privacy principles I was talking about. Is data collection necessary? Sometimes people collect data just because they can, and they figure they're going to figure out what to do with it later. That is not necessarily the best way to do it. That's probably putting the data at risk. If you decide that you do need to collect the data, aggregate it or anonymize it if you can. There are a lot of really cool ways to get the analytics and statistics that you need, even if you aggregate or anonymize the data. And that is another area of research that I'm excited to see where folks go. How long do you need to keep the data? I don't know. There's all sorts of requirements, and sometimes the answer is not very long. Sometimes the answer is, yes, I have to keep it for a year. Or forever. That's a valid answer, but you need to have a reason behind it. And then what are we going to do with the data? Scoping that out is part of this. Part of all of those questions. I think that that's one of, you need to have a reason to collect that data. One of the projects that I'm thinking about right now is how do you help the small startups, the folks that aren't in the internet industry, the folks who are moving quickly, think about this in a lightweight way, but one that's effective to help them make the right decisions. I think that will help them create that economy, create that trust, create the user benefit, and help communicate the user benefit. We get to evolve the data, we get to evolve the tools, we get to evolve the best practices. That creates a better ecosystem. As I said, this is why we're here, why Mozilla is involved with the Data Transparency Lab. We want to make the ecosystem better. We want to benefit our users. We want to benefit all web users. So how do we do that? We engage in this debate, and we want to talk across these dividing lines. And that's another reason that the DTL community is such a good fit for us. We want to talk to industry, we want to talk to civil society, we want to talk to academics and researchers, we want to talk to users, and we want to talk to power users, and we want to talk to folks who use everything straight out of the box. That will help us understand where we need to go, what tools we need, how to create defaults. As a policy shop, we engage across these lines. And while many policy shops traditionally focus on regulation and legislation, and we pay attention to that too, I think that we have an opportunity to help create cultural change. Why? Legislation is hard. If legislation was easy, we'd have it all figured out by now. In the US, we, as far as I can tell, aren't passing anything. In the EU, there's sometimes complaints that legislation is overburdensome. I think that there's a way to create control, transparency, and empowerment without having to necessarily engage in the legislative process. Regulation takes a long time. We can move much more quickly. When we work together, the community, industry, academics, researchers, I apologize for not including all of the stakeholders in all of the slides, but it would have gotten really long. Then we get to build out the core principles and ideas. We get to collect the data. We get to create the tools. And that's a win. I don't have to tell this crowd to design for trust. I'm guessing that you all do already. But we need to create that transparency. We need to create that trust. And folks often don't necessarily think about the user. If we put the user at the center, we will create better tools. And then users will trust the internet, the ecosystem across the board. So we need to create that transparency. Again, that's why we're here, and that's why I'm excited to be involved. Creating transparency with your research, with your data, will make the internet more understandable. It will help users be empowered. It will simply be a better place for all of us. We need to use that data, use that transparency to educate and create the virtuous cycle around that data and help the users understand the value exchange, help them understand why it is that their data is flowing to whatever third party, why it is that you're using their data, make it clear to them why you're benefiting them, and give them options. Options to assert control over their data, again, creates trust. This all, this is the Data Transparency Lab, but at the end of the day, this is all about trust. As I mentioned, data itself is not inherently harmful. It enhances the web, it creates products, it creates services, it helps, it helps people help me. The problem is when it's murky, when it's damaging, when people don't understand. Collecting user data to provide the user with value is helpful, it's useful. It has to be done the right way, and it comes with responsibilities. If the value exchange continues to be opaque, trust in the web will continue to deteriorate, and all of this user benefit, all of this value, all of that, great value identified by Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey, all of the user value on Wikipedia, all of these services will deteriorate. Making sure that collection is not hidden is important. Making sure the user has choices is important. Making sure the user isn't confused is important. We have to do this all in the right way. We need a deeper understanding of the concerns over data practices. We need a deeper understanding of regulator concerns. We need a deeper understanding of concerns across each stakeholder group. So that we can come together and figure out how to empower users and how to address specific concerns. Asking all of these questions and encouraging each other to ask all of these questions will, again, I hope, lead to a better web. We can't abandon the massive value of data on the web. We have to empower our users to understand what is going on with data, how to use data, how to control their data, and the choices they have. I thought I saw abused data on there, and I'm like, I wouldn't have put that on there. When I say leanly, productively, and transparently, I think those are the hallmarks of good data use. You use the data you need, you don't have the other data that you don't need. At Mozilla, we think that strong data practices, internal processes, and review according to these principles help us do that. And like I said, I'm hoping to help, that this community will help everyone else do that as well. I will say one more time, transparency is the catalyst for the new information economy. So that's, that is why this is so important. That's why we're all here. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about all of your projects. And with that, I think there's some time for Q&A.
Hi there, thank you so much. So I have a question for you. I think your talk was really interesting, but it strikes me that your idea of only collecting the data that you know you need is kind of in direct contradiction to the whole idea of big data, which is really, you know, what we also hear a lot about, which is sort of taking data and then figuring out, sort of deriving meaning from it. And I think that, you know, that kind of the contradiction that I see is that a lot of companies don't know what data they need, and that kind of stands in contradiction to the idea of being able to decide that up front. So I guess I'm curious to see how you would resolve that.
Sure. I don't have a solution for that, or I'd be a bazillionaire in Silicon Valley. I don't think it's in contradiction, actually, and that may be a little bit over-optimism. I think that companies who are collecting this data, you know, the reason to collect it may be to do kind of a broad analysis and figure out what's there, but you should be smart about what that data is, period. You know, when you're sitting down and saying, I want to collect all of the data, you know, there are implications to that. I actually tend to think that big data itself, what's the right way to say this? You know, big data is not necessarily infinite data. It is not all of the data. It is still a data set. And to the extent that machine learning and other techniques have the ability to go into that data and say, here are some interesting correlations, I think that's really useful. If you're going in and collecting everything, then you're actually going to create a lot more noise. And so even big data, even the folks who are working with huge data sets, with all sorts of disparate data and playing around and trying to figure out what's going on, it's still a limited data set. I think there are a lot of ways to do that comparison and gain the knowledge out of a large data set that are still going to be respectful of user privacy. I think that a lot of the research going on around this is really fantastic. I also point out that a huge amount of big data work is actually not personal information. And, you know, we have the opportunity to kind of come up with the best practices and the robust principles for working with big data sets as they get bigger and bigger. So that's a really long way of saying, let's figure it out.
Hi. I like to see these things you're doing in Mozilla. These are some very nice looking tools. I'm going to be a bit mean and maybe put you on the spot slightly with respect to your statement about trusting Fitbit.
Yeah. I trust Fitbit. This is not a Mozilla position. I trust Fitbit.
Yes. No, I understand.
Yes.
But I was curious about that, so I went to look at their privacy policy. So they do sell data. They say they de-identify it, but they don't really say what they do. They ask the people they sell it to not to try to re-identify you, which suggests that they probably could if they wanted. They say that if they reorganize their company, then they can give your personal data away. And of course, they can give it to the police and so on. So it's a fairly normal, to me, looking privacy statement.
I think it's a little bit better than some of the folks in the space. And it's certainly better than before they evolved it. Due to some congressional scrutiny. I'm forgetting exactly who sent them a letter, and they went in and they said, oh, okay, yeah, you're right, this could be clearer. You know, of that list of things, the one that I'm most concerned about is if Fitbit goes bankrupt, they can sell my data. That one concerns me. The rest of them seem pretty reasonable to me, and I gain a huge benefit from having them crunch my data. You know, I'm a policy wonk. I don't really know how to build something that would collect this for me. And the reality is I don't have the time or the talent. I think that Fitbit actually does a better job of calling out some of those implications than other privacy policies, and I think that credit should be given to them for that. Of course, they have legal obligations around some of the other pieces in there. To me, that says, all right, yes, we have partners. Yes, we will do our best to de-identify the data set, but we need to keep the data set useful. And so what we do is, I would assume, and maybe assumptions are a problem here, that is a contractual obligation on the part of their third party, which, in my mind, gives me a lot of comfort. And I realize I didn't let you actually finish your question. Was that what you were going for?
No, it's pretty much it. I mean, other than to point out that I think what's going to be hugely beneficial in the next 5-10 years is when this kind of data starts to be combined with diet data and with your medical records and all this stuff.
I would buy that Fitbit today.
No. It's valuable, but it's going to get interesting.
I think that there's actually a huge opportunity for the quantified self as an industry to improve people's lives. There's a noticeable difference in my activity level when I have my Fitbit on or versus when I forgot to charge it. I have friends, and I will admit to have done this before. You check your Fitbit right before bed. You realize you're 1,000 steps short. You walk in circles. That's 1,000 steps you weren't going to get. And you look like an idiot walking in circles in your living room, but it works. It's been incredibly beneficial. And so that's from my perspective, this is all a balancing proposition. If Fitbit told me that they had no third parties and they didn't talk to anyone about anything ever, I think that would probably be a missed opportunity in terms of research and integrations. So.
Thank you. I'm Lital, I'm a law professor in Israel. And I really want to believe what you're saying, that if we create a better ecosystem, do you hear me well? It's fine? Okay. If we create a better ecosystem of the internet, then users will be happier and the ecosystem will be healthier. But I don't know, because on the user side of the market, we have information problem, we have optimism bias, we have collective action, switching costs, saliency problems, so many issues that are going to make companies feel that whatever they're going to do, users are going to stay in the platform because it's just too hard to move. And on the other hand, you sell so much data to other companies that you're just making more money over there, and you can offer your product for free to users. So there is a very strong incentive for companies at this point in time to continue with this issue. And I don't know, somebody needs to be either the first one to start and in some way not lose in the competition, or some other market forces need to kind of start the process. So I was wondering, what force do you see that is going to just launch this change that you're forecasting?
So I'm coming very much. I've been at companies for the last however long, and so I have a perspective that I think is a little bit different. I think companies are hyper aware of user sentiment around this kind of thing, and to be fair, I'm talking about bigger companies who have the resources to do the user studies and that kind of thing. And when, I think Facebook notices when some fraction of a percentage of users all close their account on the same day. I remember there was a change to their privacy policy and they lost a lot of users. That's concerning to them. I think that and I do admit I am an optimist. I think that we have the opportunity to make the world better with technology, with code, with data. It could go the other direction too, and that's what we need to stop. In terms of user lock-in, I think that's where the openness comes in. We need to create the ability for users to make that choice and to talk with their feet, metaphorically, and leave when they want to. I think that there is less lock-in in many of these services than there has been in the past, because there's simply so many options. I will also admit to being one of the people who likes to try every shiny new toy on the internet. And so when these new services come around, often they are better, or they are more interesting, they are more compelling. And so the better, these services are going to create user choice. And like I said, I do think that the big companies are probably more tuned into this than you might expect. And they're going to make the balancing choices on their end the same way that we make the balancing choices on our end.
Yeah, Yingzhi from Lehigh University. So I'm interested in the work you're talking about tracking protection in Firefox. So I haven't read that yet because it just come out. It's very interesting work. So my question is, like, we know there's so many tracking protection techniques like a Tor browser. So my question is, how do you compare with those existing work like Tor browser, and what's the pros and cons? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think the Tor browser and tracking protection serve very different purposes and needs. On the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised to see something along the lines of tracking protection show up in Tor browser, in which case you can have both. I think that that's actually a really good example of what I'm talking about when I'm saying that the tools should be tailored to the user preferences and needs. If I don't want the server to know where I'm coming from, Tor browser is a great option. And then I'm going to have those third-party loads. If I don't want the third party to know anyone ever looked at the site that it's embedded on, then tracking protection is a good option. I do think that that's somewhere that user engagement, empowerment, and education is going to be key. To make a smart decision about which of those tools I want to use, I need to know what they do.
Hi, excuse me, my name is Joe Teitelbaum. I'm an entrepreneur and I've been in the media space a long time. You quoted from the IAB about they've created a big mess and their lean approach. You didn't quote their more colorful quote from last year where they referred to what they're doing as being unprotected sex, which was very amusing. And
I missed that one.
So it's there.
I believe it.
What's interesting, this theme is sort of similar to what some privacy activists have talked about in terms of not being creepy, and the shoes following you around the internet, and this all sort of comes from a sort of a part of the ecosystem that has a lot of little companies, or sort of a lot of medium-sized companies, and not a lot of big ones. Is it your sense that the crisis would be less if there was simply less creepiness?
I think that the users, if it was less creepy, I think users would care less. Sure. I get questions along the lines of, this one actually last week. Such and such a product just sent me an email promotional thing referencing Friday Night Lights. I was just watching that on Netflix. What just happened? And the reality is, I don't think it's connected, but it sure sets off the alarm bells. And this particular friend of mine was completely freaked out. She thought that in reality, Netflix was giving the advertisers her data or this product and I'm just guessing that there was a demographic decision made that she probably liked Friday Night Lights from this retailer that she did have a relationship with and did have data about her. I do think that the creepy factor has a lot to do with it. If nothing changed except that things got less creepy, that probably wouldn't be the improvement we're looking for at all. But I do think that it is very heartening that the ad space has stepped back and said, wait a second, this isn't exactly the way we want it either. And that, to me, is huge progress. And I'm saying this as someone who worked at Google. That's an advertising company. They have tons of folks who care about advertising. They have tons of folks who care about data. They have tons of folks who care about privacy. And creating a non-creepy experience. I think non-creepy is something we can set as like the low bar to achieve. But yes, I think that's one of the reasons that this is becoming a compelling topic outside of this immediate community.